Hey y'all, we're the Good Doctors of Abbey Research. I'm Dr. Kristen.
And I'm Dr. Erin.
And you are very welcome to our corner of the internet for this installment of the Colonizers World Tour. We're in Italian colonies in this book chapter, and this particular week we are discussing Libya. You're allowed to do really? Libya was an Italian colony? This is a great question. There's so much to cover here. Libya is a fascinating place. But as per usual, before we get started, let's cover what Erin and I knew before we started the Googling. What did you know about Libya?
Yeah, this is going to sound silly, but I know it's both of our answers. Everything I knew about Libya, I learned through studying the IRA.
Yep.
Which is not a lot to say, except that in the history of our study of the conflict, we learned that Gaddafi explicitly sold weapons to the RA in the 80s. I knew that. I didn't even remember that Benghazi was in Libya, but as soon as I saw that on here as a city listed, I was like, oh, now I remember more. But right when I first, what did you know about Libya? That's all. How about yourself?
Yeah, that and that it was really, and that Gaddafi was a nutter. In some way, shape, or form, Gaddafi was a nutter. And that was both confirmed and expanded, as I want to give a shout out to the podcast series Real Dictators, where I listened to an 8-hour documentary on Muammar Gaddafi and learned so much about him and about the country. And so let's go to the map and get started. If you, there's an old joke that war is how God teaches Americans geography. So if you know where Libya is, you probably, because of the Benghazi scandal in 2014, 15, 16. But if you don't know that it is in the north part of the African subcontinent, it's in between Egypt, Tunisia, and Algeria. And 90% of this, mother, is desert. And it's almost 3 times the size of Texas, just to give you a scale of what's going on. It's around 7.1 million people, and around 97% of that are people who identify as Arab or Berber. Berber, by the way, are nomadic natives of North Africa, and they predate Arab or Islamic settlements. They speak their own language, their own dialect, everything else. They were really suppressed during the Gaddafi regime. And are persecuted in many other parts of their native areas. But back to Libya, the cities are Tripoli, Benghazi, and Misrata. The languages are so many. So Arabic's official, smattering of Italian, English as well. They're all English is widely understood in Benghazi and Tripoli and Misrata for sure. And then Berber has a lot of tribal languages within it and kind of whatever. We do have a note from a couple different sources that because of Italian colonization, the Libyan Arabic has a slight Italian twang to it. And some load words, especially what they say for spaghetti and some things like that. So it's a little bit different than its neighbors in that way, is that you can definitely still see the Italian influence. And ethnic and indigenous we already covered, but I'll just say it again, 97% Berber and Arab. The other 3% are very much like the folks from all around there. Libya is not a country that has enjoyed people emigrating to it. It's mostly created refugees over the last 50 odd years. So it's still pretty homogeneous in a certain way. The currency is the dinar. $1 is around 5 dinars. So there was obviously a lot of fluctuation during the regime and at different times in the Civil War of the last 10 years, but that's where it stands right now as we talk. The system of government is a mess. So the CIA fact book very tactfully has it listed as in transition. It is, yeah. So in 2011, just really briefly, when Gaddafi was overthrown and eventually murdered while he was on the run in exile, there was so much hope that it would go, into elections and everything else is wonderful. Unfortunately, what happened instead is a protracted last 10 years civil war that has been ugly and has taken tons of lives and is just absolutely atrocious. There was some hope that there would be elections in the last year, and that it keeps getting pushed back because of safety concerns around the election. There could be renewed armed conflict even now that this election keeps getting delayed, it's a mess. Like, when you have one guy run it for 42 years, and I want you to know that in the middle of his regime, he disbanded the state of Libya, Gaddafi did, and called it, hold on, I wrote it down. You all need to hear this. The Declaration of the Establishment of the Authority of the People in 1977. He dissolved the Libyan state and gave everybody their own power. Everybody.
Yeah, sure.
Everybody has their own power. So now these folks have their own power. Then you have Gaddafi. And then you have a civil war. What are you supposed to do?
What is government?
But don't worry. Even though they had their own power, nobody got his money. So fear not. So we still need to be in awareness of the citizens of Libya who are trying very hard to exist, to trying hard to figure out what it means to be Libyan, trying hard to repair themselves after Gaddafi. At the end of the podcast, one of the British experts said, I think the memories of how awful Gaddafi is will be fresh enough to not have people longing for Gaddafi. And that is, I see on YouTube, not true. That there is quite a lot of people longing for Gaddafi to come back, because at least under Gaddafi, things made sense.
Yeah.
And under the Civil War, there's no boundaries or safety or anything else. So it's just all really sad. So the religion is, they are very, very Muslim.
Super Muslim.
Super Muslim. And I found this really interesting. This isn't my Jeopardy fun fact, but it's close. Is that they're kind of known as the most pious Muslim country, and they often win Quran competitions.
Cool.
Sure.
Cool. Thanks, Barb's at Geography Now.
Love knowing that. If you know anything about Libya, you probably, and anything other than Gaddafi, you probably know that it's oil. It is a huge oil-producing country, and throughout Gaddafi's regime, he is the only one that reaped those financial benefits. It's currently estimated that he died worth $200 billion. And nobody knows where most of the gold went, because his family smuggled it out of the country on planes after he was murdered. So all of the oil money went to him, and now there's oil money, but a lot of the videos that we link in the downstairs, the security system is so arduous and so tenuous that there is no consistent income from gas or oil, and it's, again, just a mess. Just a real mess. The greatest thing I think that I can say after learning everything is that Gaddafi went through a lot of phases. It's important to understand this now. At the beginning, he really was a revolutionary. He overthrew, as Aaron will get into, I am sure, a stooge of the West. And probably for the first 3 years, he really listened to his people and tried to give them what they wanted. And then he went through this real totalitarian phase, and then they found oil. And then all bets were off. And he used that money to sponsor terrorism all over the world and not to feed his own people. And it's a really interesting question, though, because in his mind, all he was doing was funding revolutions, because he was obsessed with revolution. Like the uprisings of Egypt and everything, he was obsessed with revolutions. The creation of Israel was an affront to his person, like his personal person. And so he wasn't ever being a terrorist. He denounced terrorism routinely in radio addresses. He was funding revolutions. And so one of the questions I think we can ask is, is one man's revolution another man's terrorism attack? Like, what is revolution?
Yeah.
And all of us who, really love the musical Les Mis, like, how do we wrestle with the cost of revolution and what that kind of looks like? So, but then he started being actively kind of taking credit for terrorist attacks, whether or not he had anything to do with them or not. So the Lockerbie bombing, the La Belle discotheque bombing, he just became kind of known as the godfather of terrorism. Like, he wrote a check, which is why he provided a lot of Russian arms to the IRA in the 1970s and 1980s. And there's actually a really interesting part of the podcast where they talk about the Libyan perceptions of Ireland.
Ooh.
And the Libyan perceptions of the IRA, that there was a British guy. They're interviewing people, and they all believed that they were funding the actual Irish government army against the British government. And so he just kind of sat, and he's like, I don't mean to burst your bubble, but you weren't. You weren't. And the guy like had no concept of that. They were constantly told that Ireland had no government.
Wow.
And that they were being, that they were supporting revolution.
Sure, yeah. If you frame everything within, like, what, it's either a revolution or it's not, sure.
So he was obsessed with Pan-Arabism for a little while, and then he was obsessed with Pan-Africanism. He's actually the one who came up with the European Union idea. And he came up with it so he could rule the entire world, but he still came up with the European Union idea, so okay. So this is this legacy of this dude. And then in his final phase, he wants to become the sweetheart of the West again. So he literally just takes his Bedouin tent and starts camping out on the front lawn of, like, the White House. And there's pictures of Tony Blair drinking tea in Muammar Gaddafi's Bedouin tent. Like, he went through a whole lot of phases. Mm-hmm. And at no point in time did he have the full love of the Libyan people. But he did seem to understand how to placate them quite a lot. And how to kind of quell things. Of course, some of that quelling was just outright sanctioned murder. And his full kind of downfall came in 2011 because there was a revealing of essentially a prison where people just went to get disappeared. But he is all of these things all at once. He's the person who built the world's largest irrigation system. And a guy who kept pet tigers. And he tried to buy Manchester United. And he also, like, systematically murdered his people. Like, but this is the legacy that they're still living with. And there's still a lot of wrestling. It's wrestling over what his legacy will be in a certain way. And so as we kind of think and talk about Libya, he's so mysterious. Mm-hmm. And yet there's some really clear patterns that we can watch. So that's kind of my thing on the economy, is you've got to understand how much Gaddafi just strangleholded it. There is no industry because he was the industry.
Yeah. And I think, we'll get into more kind of the mystery and the mythos and the ideology of Gaddafi when we talk tomorrow about the female bodyguards of Gaddafi, because I think that was one of the really interesting things that they brought out, was that he was so good at selling the ideology of the revolution and connecting it to himself in a way that the supporters didn't separate that.
Yeah.
And Gaddafi was Libya, and Libya was Gaddafi, and we'll get into it tomorrow. It's going to be a really interesting conversation. But we'll move on to demographics and some of my portions of this little 101. Because 90% of the country is desert, 90% of the population live along the Mediterranean. Shocking no one. It's a very young country, a bit older than some of the other ones in Africa and former Italian colonies that we've covered. The median age is 25. The life expectancy is 77, which is pretty high for a country that's been in conflict for so long. The fertility rate is 3 children per woman with a contraceptive prevalence rate of 27. So pretty normal for those areas of the world. 91% of the population is literate, but they have a real high unemployment rate, especially amongst young people. So, we can only take stats so far, but where stats lead us to usually is talking about human rights. Despite the fact that they've been in a civil war for 11 years, it still remains a destination country for a lot of economic migrants, especially ones hoping to flee other parts of the Middle East and gain access to Europe. So it is this hub of transit migration because of its proximity. Labor migrants have been drawn to Libya since the oil sector development in the 1960s. And until the latter part of the 90s, most migrants were Arab, primarily Egyptians and Sudanese. But obviously the 2011 revolution put a little stop to immigration for a while. And prompted nearly 800,000 migrants to flee to third countries, mainly Tunisia and Egypt. So that's a huge amount of displaced peoples. The inflow of migrants declined in 2012, but it's been on the rise ever since. Especially then when you add in the civil war in Syria and the mass influx of Syrian refugees in 2016. More than 200,000 people were displaced internally by August 2017 between the fighting, the 3 main armed groups, the 3 main ideological groups. I tried to spend a long time understanding the current political breakdown in Libya, and it's real confusing.
Yeah.
Currently, human rights are not great. You know, as in conflict regions, there's forced detention and abuse of Libyans, migrants, asylum seekers. There's a risk of serious harm or death for unexploded ordinances. Libyan Women is, I'll skip to queer folk and then go to Libyan Women because I have more to say about Libyan Women, which is a fascinating part of this puzzle. For queer folks, it's bad. It's just straight up bad. There are legal barriers for the freedom of expression, the registration or operation, whatever that means, of sexual orientation.
And I'll say too, like culturally, one of the things is that calling someone bisexual was a major slur during the regime.
Okay.
Like you could call someone a dog or a bisexual. So
yeah, so part of this comes from Gaddafi as well.
Yeah.
And it also comes from a lot of more conservative interpretations of Islam as well.
Of the Quran. Yeah.
Of the Quran. Persons criminalized for same-sex sexual acts can face up to 8 years in prison in Libya. So on the global map, it's in the not good category. Libyan Women, it's fascinating. It really is. I read up a lot on it yesterday. And then sort of learned some things from the documentary we'll discuss next.
We'll get into that one tomorrow. Yeah.
But Libyan women have long had a role in negotiating and mediating conflicts within families and clans and local communities. But that's a legacy that's often overlooked or not talked about because it lives in local cultures through oral history. So it's not really written down. It's not codified. I know, wasn't that? I found an article, I think yesterday that talked about that. They also have a long history of participating in the economic and social and political development of the country. But this changed dramatically under the Gaddafi regime, obviously. I mean, we can talk about Libya before colonization. We can talk about post-colonization Libya for maybe, 10 or so years. Almost 20, and then Gaddafi. Despite playing an active role in the 2011 revolution, their position has not really improved significantly since then. Libya's local and regional diversity means that women's experiences vary throughout the country, but by and large, they're still significantly underrepresented. They still lack basic rights and access to political participation. Their security situation is pretty crap. And we have a series of laws being amended in the past few years, legalizing discrimination against women. And then there are the laws that do exist on the books are considered pretty weak. So human rights wise, it's what you would expect from a country that decolonized, went into a 35-year dictatorship, and immediately into a civil war. It's pretty much what you would expect. But speaking of colonization, let's get to that part of the puzzle. As Kristen was talking about, Berbers have inhabited the parts of Central North Africa since way back, since the ancient times. But then the region was consequently settled by all the kinds of groups that Phoenicians, Greeks, Carthaginians, Persians, Egyptians, Greeks, Romans, and Vandals. All of them.
And Vandals, yeah.
And Vandals at the end. But in the 7th century, we get the spread of Islam through the region. And in the mid-16th century, we get the start of Ottoman rule. So prior to Italian colonization, it was actually like Ottoman colonization, really, or part of the Ottoman Empire. The Italians supplanted the Ottoman Turks, or replaced them, in the area around Tripoli in 1911, and stayed there until 1943. So Italy attacked Tripoli in 1911, claiming to liberate the province from the rule of the Ottoman Empire during the Italo-Turkish War, which was between the Kingdom of Italy and the Ottoman Empire. It was a real short war, literally 13 months. From September 1911 to October 1912. And in this war was a part of, as we have talked about a lot in our Italian Colonies month, the scramble for Africa, wherever, everyone was trying to colonize as all the bits as possible. Italians met pretty much near constant resistance from the Libyans especially from the Senussi order, which was led by Sheikh Sidi Idris al-Mahdi al-Senussi, who later became King Idris I, who was the aforementioned Western puppet, Western aligned leader post-colonization. Basically, from 1911 to 1922, there's just a crap ton of political infighting and civil war. Idris eventually flees to Egypt in 1922. Mussolini takes over at the same time. Similarly to our stories from Somalia and Ethiopia, Mussolini had his own ideas about colonization. The infighting and the violence got way worse after he assumed rule. The Libyan people really effectively resisted Italy's pacification campaign, which is the term that we use.
That's amazing. I didn't read that. Pacification campaign.
The Italian...
Oh, screw you, Mussolini.
Which was the Italian colonization, and because of the effectively resisted this pacification campaign, I love the language of colonization, their colonization of the Ottoman provinces of Tripolitania and Cyrenaica, I know I'm pronouncing that second one wrong, was initially unsuccessful, and it didn't really stick until the 1930s. And that's when the Kingdom of Italy took full control. And this conflict, this prolonged conflict, was known as the Second Italo-Sunnisi War, and ultimately resulted in the death of just around 56,000 Libyans, which is a small number for wars these days. Italy, shocking no one, committed major war crimes during the conflict, including the use of illegal chemical weapons. This is leading up to and during the start of the First World War. There was a refusal to take prisoners of war and executing surrendered combatants. There was the implementation of concentration camps, especially for ethnic minorities, and mass execution of civilians. So not a great legacy Italy was leaving. They were much more adamant and violent and fervent in their colonization of Libya, probably because it was a lot easier to get to Libya than it was to get to Somalia and Ethiopia, TBH. In 1937, the colony was split into 4 provinces: Tripoli, Misrata, Benghazi, and Derna. So it's not surprising that those are the main cities now as well. So in 1937, Mussolini visits and declared himself the protector of Islam in a very Gaddafi-esque declaration.
So the irony is, like, this is the thing that Gaddafi can never forgive white people for.
Right.
And then, like, he turns around and does the exact same thing.
He does the same thing, but it's okay because he's Muslim. Yeah. So Mussolini's plan was to fully colonize Libya, and so he planted, after his 1937 visit, 30,000 more Italian colonists and brought the number up to 100,000. So there was a lot of Italian colonists. And their plan then shifted, as it often does in colonization, more towards assimilation, along with the very fascistic and socialistic investment in infrastructure. You know? Yeah. If you want to get people on your side, you build roads, you build dams, you make things accessible, you get them healthcare. In 1939, the colony was incorporated into metropolitan Italy, and they passed, which made it, they said in the description I read of that made it like, it's kind of like what the French did with French Guiana, making it like a district. Like,
I mean, and what the French did with Italy. Like, yeah.
Like, making it more a part of the country. They also passed laws making it legal for Muslims to join the National Fascist Party. And he wanted to really assimilate the Arabs of Libya. So he also commissioned and had built 10 villages that were for Arabs and Berbers. And each village had a mosque, a school, a social center, and a small hospital.
I mean, I have a friend whose family grew up in Italy at the time and said that his grandparents never hated Mussolini because he made the trains run on time.
You know, that's literally what I put in my notes when I learned about this, like, creation of these schools and these systems and the infrastructure. So, you know, is it hunky-dory colonization by 1939? We're not sure, but you know what happens then, folks. It's World War II. Hey, in come the Allies, and they retook Cyrenaica in 1942, and by February 1943, the last of the German and Italian soldiers were driven from Libya, and the country entered into their phase of Allied occupation. In this early post-war period, Tripolitania and Cyrenaica remained under British administration, and the French-controlled Fezzan. Under UN administration, Libya was to be granted independence no later than 1952. And this was really interesting when I was reading the history of this. This was a test case for the UN because with Somaliland, with like Italian Somalia, they placed it under a 10-year Italian trusteeship. With Eritrea, another Italian colony, they deferred a decision about independence. But they were like, we're going to test this out with Libya. See how it goes.
Spoiler alert, not great.
Not great. In 1944, Idris returns from exile, and in 1947, the Italians signed a peace treaty with the Allies, in which they agreed to relinquish all control of Libya. So Libya did achieve independence by that 1952 deadline. They got it in 1951. And then they had this period of 18 years where they were ruled as a monarchy by King Idris I, and he was very much associated with and aligned with the Allies, obviously, and Western nations, thus prompting the military coup of the aforementioned Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, who assumed leadership in 1969 up until 2011, when part of what happened in Libya was what was happening in other places was the Arab Spring. And so we had massive protests erupting all over the Middle East and North Africa. Gaddafi cracked down on the protesters in a way that didn't go well for him. And then we get a civil war, which now has three main combatants. I did find a fascinating article in terms of the legacy of colonization. And please check it out. It's from Middle East Eye, and it's in the Google Doc in the downstairs, where contemporary Libyan and Italian artists are grappling with the history and the legacy and the trauma of colonization, and people whose grandparents were born in Libya to their Italian parents because they were colonists and then had to flee during the war or flee during the coup because Gaddafi exiled all of the remaining Italians. And so they were heavily under threat of physical violence at that time, and many of them fled. And kind of the ongoing legacy of the architecture and the feel and operation of parts of cities, especially Tripoli. So the Italian people, not government, the Italian people are much better at grappling with their history than the Italian government. So I'm not at all surprised to learn that there are these pockets of people that are trying to understand why it happened and the displacement and separation of families and how people feel about it. But you should really check out the article in the downstairs to read more about it. But that was one of my fascinating finds. But it was not my Jeopardy fun fact. Kristen, what was your Jeopardy fun fact?
Mine was that Gaddafi created his own flag. And it was just a solid green piece of cloth. And so that was one of the reasons we see so many of the Libyan flags that we now understand during the Arab Spring, was that they were reclaiming what it meant to be Libyan outside of Gaddafi, because he literally just created his own flag.
I really wanted to find something that wasn't Gaddafi.
It's so hard. Like, there is nothing that isn't Gaddafi right now. Like,
yeah, in terms of like a fun fact, because my fun fact when I came across it, I was like, how can I choose anything else? And my fun fact is that he had a photo album.
Yes, I love this.
Printed out photo album, physical photo album, entirely filled with pictures of Condoleezza Rice. Loved her, was obsessed with her, gave her a gift of like $10,000 when she visited. But yeah, a whole photo album, like a stalker photo album. Like, he was a fan. He was a big, big fan And, like, we used to have albums of, like, you know, the Beatles or NSYNC or whatever. You'd, like, cut out pictures from magazines and shit. He just had a whole album on Condoleezza Rice. And that, for me, was just, that took the cake. That was my fact. I know.
So, like I just said, there's really hard to have a conversation about Libya without Gaddafi. I mean, 42 years, and we're only 10 years post in a lot of ways. And those 10 years are still seeped in his legacy. One of his number twos is the head of one of the separatist movements. And so, like, we're still dealing with all of this. So the documentary that we're going to watch was actually produced in 2003. We're going to see you tomorrow for a conversation about Gaddafi's female bodyguards. Because if people know one thing about Muammar Gaddafi, besides that he always shows up he always showed up in all the military garb, most people knew that he had female bodyguards. Like, that was kind of a shtick thing. And so we're hoping we pick this documentary in the hopes that they would explain why. So join us tomorrow to see if they did. In the meantime, if you enjoyed this coverage, please hit the thumbs up, subscribe, comment, do everything. And we will be delighted to see you either next in the playlist or tomorrow for the coverage of the documentary Gaddafi's Female Bodyguards.
Bye.